Let me start with something most people never put into words. Some children grow up without ever feeling truly protected. Not from danger, not from fear, not from emotional harm. And the strange part is, many of them don't realize it until they're adults. They grow up thinking what they experienced was normal, that the constant alertness was just responsibility, that the early maturity was strength, that learning to stay quiet, adaptable, and self-reliant was a skill, not a survival response. Because when you are never protected as a child, you don't grow up feeling unsafe all the time. You grow up feeling like safety is something you must earn. This is the psychology of the child who was never protected. As a child, protection is supposed to be invisible. You're not supposed to notice it. It's meant to exist quietly in the background. Someone watching, someone stepping in, someone making sure the world doesn't overwhelm you before your mind is ready. But when protection is missing, the child notices everything. They notice tones changing in a room. They notice moods before words. They notice tension before conflict happens. Their nervous system learns early that it is on its own. And so the child adapts. They become observant. They become emotionally intelligent beyond their years. They become careful. Adults often praise this child. You're so mature for your age. You don't need much help. You're strong. But what they are really saying is, you learn to survive quietly. The unprotected child learns one powerful lesson early. No one is coming. And that belief shapes everything that follows. When a child is protected, they learn that the world has buffers, that mistakes don't equal disaster, that fear doesn't always have consequences, that someone bigger will step in if things go wrong. But when a child is not protected, consequences feel immediate and personal. If something goes wrong, they are the ones who will pay for it. So they learn to prevent problems before they exist. This is why many unprotected children become hyper-responsible adults. They don't wait for things to fall apart. They anticipate. They prepare. They carry weight long before they're asked to. Not because they want control, but because unpredictability once felt dangerous. Psychologically, this is the mind trying to create safety through vigilance. The brain learns, if I stay alert, I can reduce pain. Over time, that alertness becomes identity. They become the dependable one, the calm one, the one who doesn't panic. But inside, their nervous system never truly rests, because safety was never experienced, only managed. Another trait often seen in the child who was never protected is emotional self-containment. They don't ask for help easily. They don't express need freely. They don't assume someone will respond. As children, expressing fear or confusion may have led nowhere, or worse, it may have created more problems. So the child learns to keep emotions internal. This is not emotional coldness, it is emotional efficiency. The mind learns feeling something doesn't change anything, handling it does. And so emotions are processed privately, silently, alone. As adults, this can look like independence, but internally it feels like isolation, even in close relationships, because needing someone still feels risky. Another deep imprint of being unprotected is how the child learns to interpret love. For protected children, love feels like consistency, like presence, like reassurance. For unprotected children, love often feels conditional. Love feels earned through usefulness, through compliance, through being easy to deal with. They learn early that being low maintenance keeps peace, so they become adaptable versions of themselves. Different personality in different rooms, different emotional volume for different people. Not because they're fake, but because they learned that authenticity once had consequences. This is why many adults who were never protected struggle with knowing who they really are. They spent so much time adjusting that their original emotional shape was never mirrored back to them. Psychologically, identity forms through being seen and responded to. When protection is absent, reflection is inconsistent. So the child grows up asking questions like, am I allowed to take up space? Am I allowed to be upset? Am I too much? Even when no one is asking them to shrink. Another subtle but powerful effect is how these individuals relate to authority. They often either distrust authority deeply or become overly compliant with it. As children, authority figures may have been unpredictable, absent, or emotionally unavailable. So the brain learns two possible strategies: avoid reliance or avoid conflict. Either way, safety is self-generated, not expected. This can turn into perfectionism later in life, not the loud, obvious kind, but the quiet kind that lives inside the mind, the belief that mistakes are costly, that being prepared is necessary, that relaxing too much invites chaos. Perfectionism becomes protection in disguise, and burnout becomes the price. There's also a deep emotional loneliness that comes from never being protected, even when surrounded by people. Because protection is not just physical presence, it's emotional containment. It's knowing someone is holding the emotional weight with you. When that's missing in childhood, closeness later in life can feel unfamiliar. Not unwanted, just unfamiliar. Many unprotected children grow into adults who crave connection but feel uncomfortable receiving care. They give easily, they support naturally, they listen deeply, but when the roles reverse, something tightens inside, because being cared for requires surrender, and surrender once felt unsafe. From a neurological standpoint, this makes sense. A child's nervous system calibrates based on early experiences. When safety is inconsistent, the system stays on high alert. Even years later, in calm environments, the body remembers. This is why rest can feel uncomfortable, why silence can feel heavy, why stillness sometimes brings anxiety instead of peace. The body learned that danger comes when attention drops, so it stays ready, always. But here's the part most people miss. The child who was never protected didn't just lose something, they also developed something, a deep awareness, a strong internal compass, a sensitivity to emotional undercurrents. These individuals often understand pain without explanation. They recognize unspoken struggles. They carry empathy that wasn't taught, only lived. But empathy without boundaries becomes exhaustion, and strength without softness becomes isolation. Healing doesn't mean becoming someone else. It means teaching the nervous system something it never learned. That safety can exist without constant effort. That support can be consistent. That rest does not equal vulnerability. For many adults, this is a slow process, because the mind understands safety faster than the body. You can intellectually know you are safe and still feel tense. That doesn't mean you're broken. It means your system learned survival early. And survival patterns don't disappear just because life improves. They need repetition, gentleness, time. One of the most important steps for the unprotected child, now grown, is learning to recognize their own needs without judgment. Not dismissing them as weakness. Not minimizing them as unnecessary. Not comparing them to others, because needs don't come from immaturity. They come from being human. Another crucial step is learning to receive without performing, to allow care without earning it, to rest without justification, to be supported without guilt. This often feels uncomfortable at first, because the old belief whispers, if I don't hold it together, everything falls apart. But that belief belonged to a child. An adult can update the rules, slowly and gently. The psychology of the child who was never protected is not a story of damage. It's a story of adaptation, of a nervous system that learned too much, too soon, of a mind that carried responsibility before it had language for it, and of an adult who is still learning that safety doesn't always have to be constructed. Sometimes it can simply be allowed, and that realization, when it finally lands, changes everything. There is something deeply confusing about realizing, as an adult, that you were strong because you had no choice. Not because someone trained you, not because you were naturally resilient, but because there was no one else to hold the weight. For many people who were never protected as children, this realization doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, in moments of exhaustion, in relationships that feel strangely draining, in the sense that no matter how much you achieve, something still feels unheld. Because what was missing was not love in words, it was safety in action. Protection teaches a child one simple truth: you don't have to handle everything alone. When that truth is never learned, independence becomes overdeveloped, and dependence feels unfamiliar, even threatening. This is why many unprotected children grow into adults who struggle with delegation, trust, and rest. They don't just prefer control, they associate control with survival. From a psychological standpoint, this is the nervous system attempting to prevent overwhelm by minimizing uncertainty. If you do everything yourself, nothing surprises you. If nothing surprises you, nothing hurts you the way it once did. But this creates a life where you are always the container and rarely the contained. Another lasting imprint shows up in how these individuals process failure. For a protected child, failure is an experience. For an unprotected child, failure feels like exposure. It doesn't just mean something went wrong, it feels like something dangerous could follow, so mistakes become heavy. Not because of ego, but because the nervous system associates errors with risk. This often turns into a quiet inner pressure to be competent at all times, to not need correction, to not create inconvenience, not because they believe they must be perfect, but because imperfection once came with emotional cost. As adults, this can turn into chronic self-monitoring, replaying conversations, second-guessing decisions, overanalyzing tone, timing, and response. The mind is still scanning for safety cues. Another area where the effects become visible is intimacy. True intimacy requires the ability to soften, to let someone see you without preparation, to trust that care will remain even when you are not performing strength. For someone who was never protected, this feels foreign. They may crave closeness deeply, yet feel uncomfortable when someone gets too close. They may want support, but struggle to accept it without feeling indebted. They may long to be understood, but hide the parts of themselves that feel vulnerable, because vulnerability once came without protection, and the body remembers. This creates a push and pull dynamic in relationships. Connection feels healing, dependence feels unsafe, so they oscillate between closeness and distance, often without realizing why. It's not fear of love, it's fear of being unguarded. There is also a specific type of grief that surfaces for the unprotected child later in life. Not the obvious kind, not the dramatic kind. It's the quiet grief of realizing you never had the option to just be a child, that your calmness was not maturity, it was adaptation, that your emotional intelligence was not taught, it was required. This grief often shows up as sadness without a clear story, a sense of loss without a specific memory, an ache that doesn't attach to one moment but to an entire phase of life. Psychologically, this is called delayed processing. The mind protected itself by postponing emotional integration until safety became possible, so the feelings arrive later, and when they do, they can feel overwhelming, not because they are new, but because they were held back for so long. Many people mistake this stage for regression. They think something is wrong with them. In reality, it's the nervous system finally feeling safe enough to release what it once had to suppress. This is not weakness, it is completion. Another important piece of this psychology is how the unprotected child learns to relate to their own inner voice. Often they develop a strong internal narrator, a voice that guides, warns, plans, and prepares. This voice was once helpful. It kept them alert. It kept them ahead of problems, but over time it can become exhausting because it doesn't know how to turn off. Even in moments of calm, it scans for what could go wrong. Even in success, it prepares for the next threat. Even in rest, it whispers that rest should be earned. Learning to soften this voice is not about silencing it. It's about teaching it that danger is no longer constant, that protection can now come from within in a different way, not through vigilance, but through self-trust. One of the most healing experiences for someone who was never protected is being believed without explanation. Not having to justify pain, not having to prove exhaustion, not having to explain why something feels hard, just being met. This is often the moment where something shifts, because for the first time the nervous system receives a new message. I don't have to convince anyone to take me seriously. And slowly the body begins to relax its grip. Healing for the unprotected child is not about blaming the past. It's about updating the present. It's about learning that support does not always come with conditions, that mistakes do not equal abandonment, that rest does not lead to chaos. This learning doesn't happen through logic alone. It happens through repeated experiences of safety, through relationships that remain steady, through boundaries that are respected, through moments where you don't collapse when you let go, and perhaps most importantly, through learning to protect yourself in ways you never experienced. Not by becoming harder, but by becoming kinder to your limits. Protection in adulthood looks different. It looks like choosing environments that don't require constant alertness. It looks like honoring your capacity instead of pushing past it. It looks like allowing emotions to move through you instead of locking them inside. It looks like recognizing that you no longer need to be the strongest person in every room. Because strength was never the goal. Safety was, and safety can now be learned. Not perfectly, not overnight, but gently. The child who was never protected grew into an adult who knows how to survive. The next chapter is about learning how to live, to experience moments without scanning them, to receive care without preparing for loss, to rest without waiting for consequences. This is not forgetting what happened. It's building something new from it. A life where strength and softness can exist together, where awareness doesn't cost peace, where responsibility doesn't erase joy. And slowly, over time, the nervous system learns something it never did before, that it is finally safe to exhale, and that is not weakness, that is healing.